As soon as he recovered from the blow which had knocked him unconscious and thus wasted even more time, Elric sent for Divim Tavar. He was eager for news, but Divim Tavar could report nothing. Irkun had summoned sorceress aid to free him, sorceress aid to effect his escape.
He must have had some magical means of leaving the island, for he could not have gone by ship,
said Divim Tavar.
You must send out expeditions. Send 1,000 detachments if you must. Send every man in Melniboné. Strive to wake the dragons that they might be used. Equip the golden battle barges. Cover the world with our men if you must, but find Cymril. All those things I have already done, said Divim Tavar, save that I have not yet found Cymril.
A month passed, and Imririan warriors marched and rode through the young kingdom seeking news of their renegade countrymen.
I worried more for myself than for Cymril, and I called that morality, thought the albino. I tested my sensibilities, not my conscience.
A second month passed, and the Imririan dragons sailed the skies to the south and east, west and north. But though they flew across mountains and seas and forests and plains and unwittingly brought terror to many a city, they found no sign of Irkun and his band. For finally, one can only judge oneself by one's actions, thought Elric. I have looked at what I have done, not at what I meant to do or thought I would like to do. And what I have done has, in the main, been foolish, destructive, and with little point. Irkun was right to despise me, and that was why I hated him so. A fourth month came, and Imririan ships stopped in remote ports, and Imririan sailors questioned other travelers and explorers for news of Irkun. But Irkun's sorcery had been strong, and none had seen him or remembered seeing him. I must now consider the implications of all these thoughts, said Elric to himself. Wearily the swiftest of the soldiers began to return to Melniboné, bearing their useless news. And as faith disappeared and hope faded, Elric's determination increased. He made himself strong, both physically and mentally. He experimented with new drugs which would increase his energy rather than replenish the energy he did not share with other men. He read much in the library, though this time he read only certain grimoires, and he read those over and over again. These grimoires were written in the high speech of Melniboné, the ancient language of sorcery with which Elric's ancestors had been able to communicate with the supernatural beings they had summoned. And at last Elric was satisfied that he understood them fully, though what he read sometimes threatened to stop him in his present course of action. And when he was satisfied, for the dangers of misunderstanding the implications of the things described in the grimoires were catastrophic, he slept for 3 nights in a drugged slumber. And then Elric was ready. He ordered all slaves and servants from his quarters. He placed guards at the doors with instructions to admit no one, no matter how urgent their business. He cleared one great chamber of all furniture, so that it was completely empty, save for one grimoire, which he had placed in the very center of the room. Then he seated himself beside the book and began to think. When he had meditated for more than 5 hours, Elric took a brush and a jar of ink, and began to paint both walls and floor with complicated symbols, some of which were so intricate they seemed to disappear at an angle to the surface on which they'd been laid. At last this was done, and Elric spread-eagled himself in the very center of his huge rune, face down, one hand upon his grimoire, the other, with the Octorios upon it, stretched palm down. The moon was full. A shaft of its light fell directly on Elric's head, turning the hair to silver, and then the summoning began. Elric sent his mind into twisting tunnels of logic, across endless plains of ideas, through mountains of symbolism and endless universes of alternate truths. He sent his mind out further and further, and as it went, he sent with it the words which issued from his writhing lips, words that few of his contemporaries would understand, though their very sound would chill the blood of any listener. And his body heaved as he forced it to remain in its original position, and from time to time a groan would escape him. And through all this, a few words came again and again. One of these words was a name, Arioch. Arioch, the patron demon of Elric's ancestors, one of the most powerful of all the dukes of hell, who was called Knight of the Swords, Lord of the Seven Darks, Lord of the Higher Hell, and many more names beside. Arioch. It was on Arioch whom Yurkun had called, asking the Lord of Chaos to curse Elric. It was Arioch whom Yurkun had sought to summon to aid him in his attempt upon the Ruby Throne. It was Arioch who was known as the Keeper of the Two Black Swords, the swords of unearthly manufacture and infinite power, which had once been wielded by the emperors of Melniboné. Arioch, I summon thee. Runes, both rhythmic and fragmented, howled now from Elric's throat. His brain had reached the plane on which Arioch dwelt. Now it sought Arioch himself. Arioch, it is Elric of Melniboné who summons thee. Elric glimpsed an eye staring down at him. The eye floated, joined another. The two eyes regarded him. Arioch, my Lord of Chaos, aid me! The eyes blinked and vanished. Oh, Arioch, come to me! Come to me! Aid me, and I will serve you! A silhouette that was not a human form turned slowly until a black, faceless head looked down upon Elric. A halo of red light gleamed behind the head. Then that too vanished. Exhausted, Elric let the image fade. His mind raced back through plane upon plane. His lips no longer chanted the runes and the names. He lay exhausted upon the floor of his chamber, unable to move, in silence. He was certain that he had failed. There was a small sound. Painfully he raised his weary head. A fly had come into the chamber. It buzzed about erratically, seeming almost to follow the lines of the runes Elric had so recently painted. The fly settled first upon one rune, and then on another. It must have come in through the window, thought Elric. He was annoyed by the distraction, but still fascinated by it. The fly settled on Elric's forehead. It was a large black fly, and its buzz was loud, obscene. It rubbed its forelegs together, and it seemed to be taking a particular interest in Elric's face as it moved over it. Elric shuddered, but he did not have the strength to swat it. When it came into his field of vision, he watched it. When it was not visible, he felt its legs covering every inch of his face. Then it flew up and, still buzzing loudly, hovered a short distance from Elric's nose. And then Elric could see the fly's eyes and recognize something in them. They were the eyes, and yet not the eyes, he had seen on that other plane. It began to dawn on him that this fly was no ordinary creature. It had features that were in some way faintly human. The fly smiled at him. From his hoarse throat and through his parched lips, Elric was able to utter but one word, Arioch. And a beautiful youth stood where the fly had hovered. The beautiful youth spoke in a beautiful voice, soft and sympathetic and yet manly. He was clad in a robe that was like a liquid jewel, and yet which did not dazzle Elric, for in some way no light seemed to come from it. There was a slender sword at the youth's belt, and he wore no helm but a circlet of red fire. His eyes were wise, and his eyes were old, and when they were looked at closely, they could be seen to contain an ancient and confident evil. Elric. That was all the youth said, but it revived the albino so he could raise himself to his knees.
Elric.
And Elric could stand. He was filled with energy. The youth was taller now than Elric. He looked down at the Emperor of Melniboné, and he smiled the smile that the fly had smiled.
You alone are fit to serve Eriak. It is long since I was invited to this plane, but now that I am here, I shall aid you, Elric. I shall become your patron. I shall protect you and give you strength, and the source of strength, though master I be, and slave you be.
How must I serve you, Duke Eriak? Elric asked, having made a monstrous effort of self-control, for he was filled with terror by the implication of Eriak's words.
You will serve me by serving yourself for the moment. Later a time will come when I shall call upon you to serve me in specific ways, but for the moment I ask little of you, save that you swear to serve me.
Elric hesitated.
You must swear that, or I cannot help you in the matter of your cousin Irkun, or his sister Simul.
I swear to serve you, said Elric, and his body was flooded with ecstatic fire, and he trembled with joy, and he fell to his knees.
Then I can tell you that from time to time you can call on my aid, and I will come if your need is truly desperate. I will come in whichever form is appropriate, or no form at all, if that should prove appropriate. And now, you may ask me one question before I depart.
I need the answers to 2 questions.
Your first question I cannot answer. I will not answer. You must accept that you have now sworn to serve me. I will not tell you what the future holds, but you need not fear if you serve me well.
Then my second question is this. Where is Prince Irkun?
Prince Irkun is in the south, in a land of barbarians. By sorcery and by superior weapons and intelligence, he has effected the conquest of 2 mean nations, one of which is called Oin, and the other is called Yu. Even now he trains the men of Oin and the men of Yu to march upon Melniboné, for he knows that your forces are spread thinly across the earth, searching for him.
How has he hidden?
He has not, but he has gained possession of the Mirror of Memory, a magical device whose hiding place he discovered by his sorceries. Those who look into this mirror have their memories taken. The mirror contains 1,000,000 memories, the memories of all who have looked into it. Thus anyone who ventures into Oin or Yu, or travels by sea to the capital which serves both, is confronted by the mirror, and forgets that he has seen Prince Irkun and his Imririans in those lands. It is the best way of remaining undiscovered.
It is. Therefore it might be wise to consider destroying the mirror. But what would happen then, I wonder? Eriak raised his beautiful hand.
Although I have answered further questions which are, one could argue, part of the same question, I will answer no more. It could be in your interest to destroy the mirror, but it might be better to consider other means of countering its effects, for it does, I remind you, contain many memories, some of which have been imprisoned for thousands of years. Now, I must go, and you must go, to the lands of Oin and Yu, which lie several months' journey from here, to the south, and well beyond Lolmir. They are best reached by the ship which sails over both land and sea. Farewell, Elric.
And a fly buzzed for a moment upon the wall before vanishing. Elric rushed from the room, shouting for his slaves. And how many dragons still sleep in the caverns? Elric paced the gallery overlooking the city. It was morning, but no sun came through the dull clouds which hung low upon the towers of the dreaming city. Ymrir's life continued unchanged in the streets below, save for the absence of the majority of her soldiers, who had not yet returned home from their fruitless quests, and would not be home for many months to come. Divem Tavar leaned on the parapet of the gallery and stared unseeingly into the streets. His face was tired, and his arms were folded on his chest as if he sought to contain what was left of his strength. 2, perhaps. It would take a great deal to wake them, and even then I doubt if they'd be useful to us. What is this ship which sails over land and sea, which Ariok spoke of? I've read of it before in the Silver Grimoire and in other tomes, a magic ship, used by a Melnibonéan hero even before there was Melniboné and the Empire. But where it exists, and if it exists, I do not know. Who would know? Divem Tavar straightened his back and turned it on the scene below. Ariok? Elric shrugged. But he would not tell me. What of your friends the water elementals? Have they not promised you aid? And would they not be knowledgeable in the matter of ships? Elric frowned, deepening the lines which now marked his face. Aye, Strasha might know, but I am loath to call on his aid again. The water elementals are not the powerful creatures that the Lords of Chaos are. Their strength is limited, and moreover they are inclined to be capricious in the manner of the elements. What is more, Divem Tavar, I hesitate to use sorcery, save where absolutely imperative. You are a sorcerer, Elric. You have but lately proved your greatness in that respect, involving the most powerful of all sorceries, the summoning of a Chaos Lord, and you still hold back. I would suggest, my Lord King, that you consider such logic, and that you judge it unsound. You decided to use sorcery in your pursuit of Prince Irkun. The die is already cast. It would be wise to use sorcery now. You cannot conceive of the mental and physical effort involved. I can conceive of it, my lord. I am your friend. I do not wish to see you pained, and yet there is also the difficulty, Divem Tavar, of my physical weakness. How long can I continue in the use of these overstrong potions that now sustain me? They supply me with energy, aye, but they do so by using up my few resources. I might die before I find Cimmeril. I stand rebuked. But Elric came forward and put his white hand on Divem Tavar's butter-colored cloak. But what have I to lose, eh? No, you are right. I am a coward to hesitate when Cimmeril's life is at stake. I repeat my stupidities, the stupidities which first brought this pass upon us all. I'll do it. Will you come with me to the ocean? Aye. Divem Tavar began to feel the burden of Elric's conscience settling upon him also. It was a peculiar feeling to come to a Melnibonéan, and Divem Tavar knew very well that he liked it not at all. Elric had last ridden these paths when he and Cimmeril were happy. It seemed a long age ago. He had been a fool to trust that happiness. He turned his white stallion's head toward the cliffs and the sea beyond them. A light rain fell. Winter was descending swiftly on Melniboné. They left their horses on the cliffs lest they be disturbed by Elric's sorcery working, and clambered down to the shore. The rain fell into the sea. A mist hung over the water little more than 5 ship lengths from the beach. It was deathly still, and with the tall, dark cliffs behind them and the wall of mist before them, it seemed to Divem Tavar that they'd entered a silent netherworld, where might easily be encountered the melancholy souls of those who, in legend, had committed suicide by a process of slow self-mutilation. The sound of the two men's boots on shingle was loud, and yet was at once muffled by the mist, which seemed to suck at noise and swallow it greedily, as if it sustained its life on sound. "Now," Elric murmured. He seemed not to notice the brooding and depressive surroundings. "Now I must recall the rune which came so easily, unsummoned to my brain not many months since." He left Divem Tavar's side and went down to the place where the chill water lapped the land, and there, carefully, he seated himself cross-legged. His eyes stared unseeingly into the mist. To Divem Tavar, the tall albino appeared to shrink as he sat down. He seemed to become like a vulnerable child, and Divem Tavar's heart went out to Elric, as it might go out to a brave, nervous boy. And Divem Tavar had it in mind to suggest that the sorcery be done with, and they seek the lands of Oin and you by ordinary means. But Elric was already lifting his head as a dog lifts its head to the moon, and strange, thrilling words began to tumble from his lips, and it became plain that even if Divem Tavar did speak now, Elric would not hear him. Divem Tavar was no stranger to the high speech. As a Melnibonéan noble, he had been taught it as a matter of course, but the words seemed none the less strange to him, for Elric used peculiar inflections and emphases, giving the words a special and secret weight, and chanting them in a voice which ranged from a bass groan to a falsetto shriek. It was not pleasant to listen to such noises coming from a mortal throat, and now Divem Tavar had some clear understanding of why Elric was reluctant to use sorcery. The Lord of the Dragon Caves, Melnibonéan though he was, found himself inclined to step backward a pace or two, even to retire to the cliff tops and watch over Elric from there, and he had to force himself to hold his ground as the summoning continued. For a good space of time the rune chanting went on. The rain beat harder upon the pebbles of the shore and made them glisten. It dashed most ferociously into the still, dark sea, lashed about the fragile head of the chanting, pale-haired figure, and caused Divem Tavar to shiver and draw his cloak more closely about his shoulders. "Strasha, Strasha, Strasha." The words mingled with the sound of the rain. They were now barely words at all, but sounds which the wind might make, or a language which the sea might speak. "Strasha." Again Divem Tavar had the impulse to move, but this time he desired to go to Elric and tell him to stop, to consider some other means of reaching the lands of Oin and you. "Strasha." There was a cryptic agony in the shout. "Strasha." Elric's name formed on Divem Tavar's lips, but he found that he could not speak it. "Strasha." The cross-legged figure swayed. The word became the calling of the wind through the caverns of time. "Strasha." It was plain to Divem Tavar that the rune was, for some reason, not working, and that Elric was using up all his strength to no effect. And yet there was nothing the Lord of the Dragon Caves could do. His tongue was frozen. His feet seemed frozen. His feet seemed frozen to the ground. He looked at the mist. Had it crept closer to the shore? Had it taken on a strange, almost luminous green tinge? He peered closely. There was a massive disturbance of the water. The sea rushed up the beach. The shingle crackled. The mist retreated. Vague lights flickered in the air, and Divem Tavar thought he saw the shining silhouette of a gigantic figure emerging from the sea, and he realized that Elric's chant had ceased. "King Strasha," Elric was saying in something approaching his normal tone, You have come. I thank you." The silhouette spoke, and the voice reminded Divum Tavar of slow, heavy waves rolling beneath a friendly sun. "We elementals are concerned, Elric, for there are rumors that you have invited Chaos Lords back to your plane, and the elementals have never loved the Lords of Chaos. Yet I know that if you have done this, it is because you are fated to do it, and therefore we hold no enmity against you." "The decision was forced upon me, King Strasha. There was no other decision I could make. If you are reluctant to aid me, I shall understand that, and call on you no more." "I will help you, though helping you is harder now, not for what happens in the immediate future, but what is hinted will happen in years to come. Now, you must tell me quickly how we of the water can be of service to you." "Do you know aught of the ship which sails over land and sea? I need to find that ship if I am to fulfill my vow to find my love, Cymmeril." "I know much of that ship, for it is mine. Grome also lays claim to it, but it is mine. Fairly, it is mine." "Grome of the earth?"
"Grome of the land below the roots, Grome of the ground and all that lives under it. My brother, Grome. Long since, even as we elementals count time, Grome and I built that ship so that we could prevail between the realms of earth and water whenever we chose. But we quarreled, may we be cursed for such foolishness, and we fought. There were earthquakes, tidal waves, volcanic eruptions, typhoons and battles in which all the elementals joined, with the result that new continents were flung up and old ones drowned. It was not the first time we fought each other, but it was the last. And finally, lest we destroy each other completely, we made a peace. I gave Grome part of my domain, and he gave me the ship which sails over land and sea. But he gave it somewhat unwillingly, and thus it sails the sea better than it sails the land, for Grome thwarts its progress whenever he can. Still, if the ship is of use to you, you shall have it."
"I thank you, King Strasha. Where shall I find it?"
"It will come. And now I grow weary, for the further from my own realm I venture, the harder it is to sustain my mortal form. Farewell, Elric, and be cautious. You have a greater power than you know, and many would make use of it to their own ends."
"Shall I wait here for the ship which sails over land and sea?"
"No."
The Sea King's voice was fading as his form faded. Grey mist drifted back where the silhouette and the green lights had been. The sea, again, was still.
Wait in your tower. It will come."
A few wavelets lapped the shore, and then it was as if the King of the Water elementals had never been there at all. Divum Tavar rubbed his eyes. Slowly at first he began to move where Elric still sat. Gently he bent down and offered the albino his hand. Elric looked up in some surprise. "Ah, Divum Tavar, how much time has passed?" "Some hours, Elric. It will soon be night. What little light there is begins to wane. We had best ride back for Imrir." Stiffly Elric rose to his feet with Divum Tavar's assistance. "Aye, the Sea King said—" "I heard the Sea King, Elric. I heard his advice and I heard his warning. You must remember to heed both. I like too little the sound of this magic boat. Like most things of sorcerous origin, the ship appears to have vices as well as virtues. Like a double-bladed knife,
which you raise to stab your enemy, and which, instead, stabs you.
That must be expected where sorcery is concerned. It was you who urged me on, my friend.
Aye, said Divem Devar, almost to himself, as he led the way up the cliff path towards the horses. Aye, I have not forgotten that, my lord king.
Elric smiled and touched Divem Devar's arm. Worry not. The summoning is over, and now we have the vessel we need to take us swiftly to Prince Yrkun and the lands of Oin and you.
Let us hope so.
Divem Devar was privately skeptical about the benefits they would gain from the ship which sails over land and sea. They reached the horses, and he began to wipe the water off the flanks of his own roan.
I regret that we have once again allowed the dragons to expend their energy on a useless endeavor. With the squadron of my beast we could do much against Prince Yrkun. And it would be fine and wild, my friend, to ride the skies again side by side, as we used to.
When all this is done, and Princess Cymril brought home, we shall do that, said Elric, hauling himself wearily into the saddle of his white stallion. You shall blow the dragon horn, and our dragon brothers will hear it, and you and I shall sing the song of the dragon masters, and our goads shall flash as we straddle Flamefang and his mate Sweetclaw. Ah, that will be like the days of old Melniboné, when we no longer equate freedom with power, but let the young kingdoms go their own way, and be certain that they let us go ours. Divem Devar pulled on his horse's reins. His brow was clouded.
Let us pray that day will come, my lord. But I cannot help this nagging thought which tells me that Imrir's days are numbered, and that my own life nears its close.
Nonsense, Divem Devar. You will survive me. There's little doubt of that, though you be my elder. Divem Devar said as they galloped back through the closing day.
I have 2 sons. Did you know that, Elric?
You have never mentioned them.
They are by my old mistresses.
I am happy for you.
They are fine Melnibonéans.
Why do you mention this, Divem Devar? Elric tried to read his friend's expression.
It is that I love them, and would have them enjoy the pleasures of the Dragon Isle.
And why should they not?
I do not know. I could suggest that it is your responsibility, the fate of my sons, Elric.
Mine?
It seems to me, from what I gathered from the Water Elemental's words, that your decisions could decide the fate of the Dragon Isle. I ask you to remember my sons, Elric.
I shall, Divem Devar. I am certain they shall grow into superb dragon masters, and that one of them shall succeed you as Lord of the Dragon Caves.
I think you miss my meaning, my Lord Emperor.
And Elric looked solemnly at his friend and shook his head. I do not miss your meaning, old friend, but I think you judge me harshly if you fear I'll do aught to threaten Melniboné and all she is.
Forgive me, then.
Divem Devar lowered his head, but the expression in his eyes did not change. In Imrir they changed their clothes and drank hot wine and had spiced food brought. Elric, for all his weariness, was in better spirits than he had been for many a month, and yet there was still a tinge of something behind his surface mood, which suggested he encouraged himself to speak gaily and put vitality into his movements. Admittedly, thought Divem Devar, the prospects had improved, and soon they would be confronting Prince Yrkun. But the dangers ahead of them were unknown, the pitfalls probably considerable. Still, he did not, out of sympathy for his friend, want to dispel Elric's mood. He was glad, in fact, that Elric seemed in a more positive frame of mind. there was talk of the equipment they would need in their expedition to the mysterious lands of Yu and Oin, speculation concerning the capacity of the ship which sails over land and sea, how many men it would take, what provisions they should put aboard, and so on. When Elric went to his bed, he did not walk with the dragging tiredness which had previously accompanied his step, and again bidding him good night, Divem Tavar was struck by the same emotion which had filled him on the beach, watching Elric begin his rune. Perhaps it was not by chance that he had used the example of his sons when speaking to Elric earlier that day, for he had a feeling that was almost protective, as if Elric were a boy looking forward to some treat which might not bring him the joy he expected. Divem Tavar dismissed the thoughts as best he could, and went to his own bed. Elric might blame himself for all that had occurred in the question of Irkun and Cymril, but Divem Tavar wondered if he too were not to blame in some part. Perhaps he should have offered his advice more cogently, more vehemently even, earlier, and made a stronger attempt to influence the young emperor. And then, in the Melnibonéan manner, he dismissed such doubts and questions as pointless. There was only one rule: seek pleasure however you would. But had that always been the Melnibonéan way? Divem Tavar wondered suddenly if Elric might not have regressive rather than deficient blood. Could Elric be a reincarnation of one of their most distant ancestors? Had it always been in the Melnibonéan character to think only of oneself and one's own gratification? And again Divem Tavar dismissed the questions. What use was there in questions? After all, the world was the world. A man was a man. Before he sought his own bed, he went to visit both his old mistresses, waking them up and insisting that he see his sons, Divem Slorm and Divem Mav. And when his sons, sleepy-eyed, bewildered, had been brought to him, he stared at them for a long while before sending them back. He had said nothing to either, but he brought his brows together frequently and rubbed at his face and shaken his head, and when they were gone, he said to Niopal and Saramal, his mistresses, who were as bewildered as their offspring, "Let them be taken to the dragon caves tomorrow, and begin their learning." "So soon, Divem Tavar?" said Niopal. "Aye. There's little time left, I fear." He would not amplify on this remark because he could not. It was merely a feeling he had, but it was a feeling that was growing almost to the point where it was becoming an obsession with him. In the morning, Divem Tavar returned to Elric's tower and found the Emperor pacing the gallery above the city, asking eagerly for any news of a ship sighted off the coast of the island. But no such ship had been seen. Servants answered earnestly that if their emperor could describe the ship, it would be easier for them to know for what to look. But he could not describe the ship, and could only hint that it might not be seen on water at all, but might appear on land. He was all dressed up in his black war gear, and it was plain to Divem Tavar that Elric was indulging in even larger quantities of the potions which replenished his blood. The crimson eyes gleamed with a hot vitality, the speech was rapid, and the bone-white hands moved with unnatural speed when Elric made even the lightest gesture. "Are you well this morning, my lord?" "In excellent spirits, thank you, Divem Tavar, though I'd feel even better if the ship which sails over land and sea were here now." He went to the balustrade and leaned upon it, peering over the towers and beyond the city walls, looking first to the sea and then to the land. "Where can it be? I wish that King Strasha had been able to be more specific." "I'll agree with that." Divem Tavar, who had not breakfasted, helped himself from the variety of succulent foods laid upon the table. It was evident that Elric had eaten nothing. Divem Tavar began to wonder if the volume of potions had not affected his old friend's brain. Perhaps madness, brought about by his involvement with complicated sorcery, his anxiety for Cymril, and his hatred of Irkun, had begun to overwhelm Elric. "Would it not be better to rest and to wait until the ship is sighted?" Aye, there's reason in that. But I cannot. I have an urge to be off, Divum Tavar, to come face to face with Yirkun, to have my revenge on him, and to be united with Cimmerl again. I understand that, yet still... You fret like tanglebones over my well-being. I do not need 2 nursemaids, Lord of the Dragon Caves. With an effort, Divum Tavar smiled. You are right. Well, I pray that this magic vessel will... What is that? He pointed out across the land. A movement in yonder forest, as if the wind passes through it, but there is no sign of wind elsewhere. Elric followed his gaze. You are right. I wonder. And then they saw something emerge from the forest, and the land itself seemed to ripple. It was something which glinted white and blue and black. It came closer. A sail. It is your ship, I think, my lord. Aye, my ship. Make yourself ready, Divum Tavar. By midday, we shall be gone from Imrir. The ship was tall and slender, and she was delicate. Her rails, masts, and bulwarks were exquisitely carved and obviously not the work of a mortal craftsman. Though built of wood, the wood was not painted, but naturally shone blue and black and green, and a kind of deep smoky red. And her rigging was the color of seaweed, and there were veins in the planks of her polished deck, like the roots of trees, and the sails on her 3 tapering masts were as fat and white and light as clouds on a fine summer day. The ship was everything that was lovely in nature. Few could look upon her and not feel delighted, as they might be delighted upon sighting a perfect view. In a word, the ship radiated harmony, and Elric could think of no finer vessel in which to sail against Prince Yirkun and the dangers of the lands of Oin and Yu. The ship sailed gently in the ground, as if upon the surface of a river, and the earth beneath the keel rippled, as if turned momentarily to water. Wherever the keel of the ship touched, and a few feet around it, this effect became evident, though after the ship had passed, the ground would return to its usual stable state. This was why the trees of the forest had swayed as the ship passed through them, parting before the keel as the ship sailed towards Imrir. The ship which sails over land and sea was not particularly large. Certainly she was considerably smaller than a Melnibonean battle barge, and only a little bigger than a southern galley. But the grace of her, the curve of her line, the pride of her bearing, in these she had no rival at all. Already her gangplanks had been lowered down to the ground, and she was being made ready for her journey. Elric, hands on his slim hips, stood looking up at King Strasha's gift. From the gates of the city wall, slaves were bearing provisions and arms and carrying them up the gangways. Meanwhile, Divum Tavar was assembling the Imririan warriors and assigning them their ranks and duties while on the expedition. There were not many warriors. Only half the available strength could come with the ship, for the other half must remain behind, under the command of Admiral Makum Colleen, and protect the city. It was unlikely there would be any large attack on Melniboné after the punishment meted out to the barbarian fleet, but it was wise to take precautions, particularly since Prince Yirkun had vowed to conquer Imrir. Also, for some strange reason that none of the onlookers could divine, Divum Tavar had called for volunteers, veterans who shared a common disability, and made up a special detachment of these men who, so the onlookers thought, could be of no use at all to the expedition. Still, neither were they of use when it came to defending the city, so they might as well go. These veterans were led aboard first. Last to climb the gangway was Elric himself. He walked slowly, heavily, a proud figure in his black armor, until he reached the deck. Then he turned, saluted his city, and ordered the gangplank raised. Divum Tavar was waiting for him on the poop deck. The Lord of the Dragon Caves had stripped off one of his gauntlets and was running his naked hand over the oddly colored wood of the rail. "This is not a ship made for war, Elric. I should not like to see it harmed." "How can it be harmed?" Elric asked lightly as Imririans began to climb the rigging and adjust the sails. "Would Strasha let it be destroyed? Would Grome? Fear not for the ship which sails over land and sea, Divin Tavar. Fear only for our own safety and the success of our expedition. Now, let us consult the charts. Remembering Strasha's warning concerning his brother Grome, I suggest we travel by sea for as far as possible, calling in here." He pointed to a seaport on the western coast of Loromir. "To get our bearings and learn what we can of the lands of Oin and Yu, and how those lands are defended. Few travelers have ever ventured beyond Loromir. It is said that the edge of the world lies not far from that country's most southerly borders." Divim Tavar frowned. "Could not this whole mission be a trap, I wonder? Ariok's trap. What if he is in league with Prince Irkun, and we have been completely deceived into embarking upon an expedition which will destroy us?" "I have considered that, but there is no other choice. We must trust Ariok." "I suppose we must. Another matter now occurs to me. How does the ship move? I saw no anchors we could raise, and there are no tides that I know of that sweep across the land. The wind fills the sails, see?" It was true. The sails were billowing and the masts creaked slightly as they took the strain. Elric shrugged and spread his hands. "I suppose we must tell the ship. Ship, we are ready to sail." Elric took some pleasure in Divim Tavar's expression of astonishment as, with a lurch, the ship began to move. It sailed smoothly as over a calm sea, and Divim Tavar instinctively clutched the rail, shouting, "But we are heading directly for the city wall!" Elric crossed quickly to the center of the poop, where a large lever lay, horizontally attached to a ratchet, which in turn was attached to a spindle. This was almost certainly the steering gear. Elric grasped the lever as one might grasp an oar and pushed it round a notch or two. Immediately the ship responded and turned towards another part of the wall. Elric hauled back on the lever and the ship leaned, protesting a little as she yawed around and began to head out across the island. Elric laughed in delight. "You see, Divim Tavar, it is easy. A slight effort of logic was all it took." "Nonetheless, I'd rather we rode dragons. At least they are beasts and may be understood, but this sorcery, it troubles me." "Those are not fitting words for a noble of Melniboné." "Perhaps not. Perhaps that explains why I stand beside you now, my lord." Elric darted his friend a puzzled look before he went below to find a helmsman whom he could teach how to steer the ship. The ship sped swiftly over rocky slopes and up gorse-covered hills. She cut her way through forests and sailed grandly over grassy plains. She moved like a low-flying hawk which keeps close to the ground but progresses with incredible speed and accuracy as it searches for its prey, altering its course with an imperceptible flick of a wing. The soldiers of Imrir crowded her decks, gasping in amazement at the ship's progress over the land, and many of the men had to be clouted back to their positions at the sails or elsewhere about the ship. The huge warrior who acted as bosun seemed the only member of the crew unaffected by the miracle of the ship. He was behaving as he would normally behave aboard one of the golden battle barges, going solidly about his duties and seeing to it that all was done in a proper seamanly manner. The helmsman Elric had selected was, on the other hand, wide-eyed and somewhat nervous of the ship he handled. You could see that he felt he was at any moment going to be dashed against a slab of rock or smash the ship apart in a tangle of thick-trunked pines. He was forever wetting his lips and wiping sweat from his brow, even though the air was sharp and his breath steamed as it left his throat. Yet he was a good helmsman, and gradually he became used to handling the ship, though his movements were, perforce, more rapid, for there was little time to deliberate upon a decision. The ship traveled with such speed over the land. The speed was breathtaking. They sped more swiftly than any horse, were swifter even than Divam Tavar's beloved dragons. Yet the motion was exhilarating, too, as the expressions on the faces of all the Imririans told. Elric's delighted laughter rang through the ship and infected many another member of the crew. "Well, if Grome of the Roots is trying to block our progress, I hesitate to guess how fast we shall travel when we reach water." Divam Tavar had lost some of his earlier mood. His long, fine hair streamed around his face, and he smiled at his friend. "Aye, we shall all be whisked off the deck and into the sea." And then, as if in answer to their words, the ship began suddenly to buck, and at the same time sway from side to side like a ship caught in powerful cross-currents. The helmsman went white and clung to his lever, trying to get the ship back under control. There came a brief, terrified yell, and a sailor fell from the highest cross-tree in the main mast and crashed onto the deck, breaking every bone in his body. And then the ship swayed once or twice, and the turbulence was behind them, and they continued on their course. Elric stared at the body of the fallen sailor. Suddenly the mood of gaiety left him completely, and he gripped the rail in his black gauntleted hands, and he gritted his strong teeth, and his crimson eyes glowed, and his lips curled in self-mockery. "What a fool I am! What a fool I am to tempt the gods so!" Still, though the ship moved almost as swiftly as it had done, there seemed to be something dragging at it, as if Grome's minions clung on to the bottom as barnacles might cling in the sea. And Elric sensed something around him in the air, something in the rustling of the trees through which they passed, something in the movement of the grass and the bushes and the flowers over which they crossed, something in the weight of the rocks, of the angle of the hills, and he knew that what he sensed was the presence of Grome of the ground, Grome of the land below the roots, Grome who desired to own what he and his brother Strasha had once owned jointly, what they had had made as a sign of unity between them and over which they had then fought. Grome wanted very much to take back the ship which sails over land and sea, and Elric, staring down at the black earth, became afraid. But at last, with the land tugging at their keel, they reached the sea, sliding into the water and gathering speed with every moment, until Melniboné was gone behind them, and they were sighting the thick clouds of steam which hung forever over the boiling sea. Elric thought it unwise to risk even this magical vessel in those peculiar waters, so the vessel was turned and headed for the coast of Lormir, sweetest and most tranquil of the young kingdom nations, and the port of Ramazaz on Lormir's western shore. If the southern barbarians with whom they'd so recently fought had been from Lormir, Elric would have considered making for some other port, but the barbarians almost certainly had been from the southeast, on the far side of the continent, beyond Picaride. The Lormirians, under their fat, cautious King Fadan, were not likely to join a raid unless its success were completely assured. Sailing slowly into Ramazaz, Elric gave directions that the ship be moored in a conventional way and treated like any ordinary ship. It attracted attention nonetheless for its beauty, and the inhabitants of the port were astonished to find Melnibonéans crewing the vessel. Though Melnibonéans were disliked throughout the young kingdoms, they were also feared. Thus, outwardly at any rate, Elric and his men were treated with respect, and were served reasonably good food and wine at the hostelries they entered. In the largest of the waterfront inns, a place called Heading Outward and Coming Safely Home Again, Elric found a garrulous host who had, until he bought the inn, been a prosperous fisherman, and who knew the southernmost shores reasonably well. He certainly knew the lands of Oin and Yu, but he had no respect for them at all.
"You think they could be massing for war, my lord?" He raised his eyebrows at Elric before hiding his face in his wine mug. Wiping his lips, he shook his red head. "Then they must war against sparrows. Oin and you are barely nations at all. Their only halfway decent city is Doge Cam, and that is shared between them, half being on one side of the River Ar, and half being on the other. As for the rest of Oinu, it's inhabited by peasants, who are for the most part so ill-educated and superstition-ridden that they are poverty-stricken, not a potential soldier among them.
You've heard nothing of a Melnibonean renegade who has conquered Oinu and set about training these peasants to make war?
Divum Tavar leaned on the bar next to Elric. He sipped fastidiously from a thick cup of wine.
Prince Yarkoon is the renegade's name.
Is that who you seek? The innkeeper became more interested. A dispute between the dragon princes, eh?
That's our business, said Elric haughtily.
Of course, my lords.
You know nothing of a great mirror which steals men's memories?
A magical mirror? I doubt if there's one decent mirror in the whole of Oin or you. No, my lords, I think you are misled if you fear danger from those lands.
Doubtless you are right, but it would be wise if we were to check for ourselves, and it would be in Lormir's interest, too, if we were to find what we seek and warn you accordingly.
Fear not for Lormir. We can easily deal with any silly attempt to make war from that quarter, but if you'd see for yourselves, you must follow the coast for 3 days until you come to a great bay. The river Ar runs into that bay, and on the shores of the river lies Dojkam, a seedy sort of city, particularly for a capital serving 2 nations. The inhabitants are corrupt, dirty, and disease-ridden, but fortunately they're also lazy, and thus afford little trouble, especially if you keep a sword by you. When you have spent an hour in Dojkam, you will realize the impossibility of such folk becoming a menace to anyone else, unless they should get close enough to you to infect you with one of their several plagues. Again the innkeeper laughed hugely at his own wit. As he ceased shaking, he added, "Oh, unless you fear their navy. It consists of a dozen or so filthy fishing boats, most of which are so unseaworthy they dare only fish in the shallows of the estuary."
Elric pushed his wine cup aside. "We thank you, landlord." He placed a Melnibonean silver piece upon the counter.
"This will be hard to change," said the innkeeper craftily.
"There is no need to change it on our account."
"I thank you, masters. Would you stay the night at my establishment? I can offer you the finest beds in Ramessas."
"I think not. We shall sleep aboard our ship tonight, that we might be ready to sail at dawn." The landlord watched the Melniboneans depart. Instinctively, he bit at the silver piece, and then, suspecting he tasted something odd about it, removed it from his mouth. He stared at the coin, turning it this way and that. Could Melnibonean silver be poisonous to an ordinary mortal, he wondered? It was best not to take risks. He tucked the coin into his purse and collected up the 2 wine cups they'd left behind. Although he hated waste, he decided it would be wiser to throw the cups out, lest they should have become tainted in some way. The ship which sails over land and sea reached the bay at noon on the following day, and now it lay close inshore, hidden from the distant city by a short isthmus on which grew thick, near-tropical foliage. Elric and Divum Tavar waded through the clear, shallow water to the beach and entered the forest. They decided to be cautious and not make their presence known until they had determined the truth of the innkeeper's contemptuous description of Dojkam. Near the tip of the isthmus was a reasonably high hill, and growing on the hill were several good-sized trees. Elric and Divum Tavar used their swords to clear a path through the undergrowth and make their way up the hill until they stood under the trees, picking out the one most easily climbed. Elric selected a tree whose trunk bent and then straightened out again. He sheathed his sword, got his hands onto the trunk, and hauled himself up, clambering along until he reached a succession of thick branches which could bear his weight. In the meantime, Divum Tavar climbed another nearby tree, until at last both men could get a good view across the bay, where the city of Dojkam could be clearly seen. Certainly the city itself deserved the innkeeper's description. It was squat and grimy and evidently poor.
Doubtless this was why Irkun had chosen it, for the lands of Oin and Yu could not have been hard to conquer with the help of a handful of well-trained Imririans and some of Irkun's sorcerous allies. Indeed, few would have bothered to conquer such a place, since its wealth was plainly virtually non-existent, and its geographical position of no strategic importance. Irkun had chosen well, for purposes of secrecy if nothing else. But the landlord had been wrong about Doge Cam's fleet. Even from here, Elric and Divim Tavar could make out a good 30 good-sized warships in the harbor, and there seemed to be more anchored upriver. But the ships did not interest them as much as the thing which flashed and glittered above the city, something which had been mounted on huge pillars which supported an axle, which in turn supported a vast, circular mirror set in a frame whose workmanship was as plainly non-mortal as that of the ship which had brought the Melnibonéans here. There was no doubt that they looked upon the mirror of memory, and that any who had sailed into the harbor after it had been erected must have had their memory of what they had seen stolen from them instantly.
It seems to me, my lord, that it would be unwise of us to sail directly into the harbor of Doge Cam. Indeed, we could be in danger if we entered the bay. I think that we look upon the mirror, even now, only because it is not pointed directly at us. But you notice there is machinery to turn it in any direction its user chooses, save one. It cannot be turned inland behind the city. There is no need for it, for who would approach Oin and Yu from the wastelands beyond their borders, and who but the inhabitants of Oin and Yu would need to come overland to their capital?
I think I take your meaning, Divim Tavar. You suggest that we would be wise to make use of the special properties of our ship and
go overland to Doge Cam, striking suddenly and making full use of those veterans we brought with us, moving swiftly and ignoring Prince Yarkun's new allies, seeking the prince himself and his renegades. Could we do that, Elric? Dash into the city, seize Yarkun, rescue Cimmerl, and then speed out again and away?
Since we have too few men to make a direct assault, it is all we can do, though it is dangerous. The advantage of surprise would be lost, of course, once we made the attempt. If we failed in our first attempt, it would become much harder to attack a second time. The alternative is to sneak into the city at night and hope to locate Irkun and Cimmerl alone. But then we should not be making use of our one important weapon, the ship which sails over land and sea. I think your plan is the best one, Divim Tavar. Let us turn the ship inland now, and hope that Grome takes his time in finding us, for I still worry lest he try seriously to wrest the ship from our possession. Elric began to climb down towards the ground. Standing once more on the poop deck of the lovely ship, Elric ordered the helmsman to turn the vessel once again towards the land. Under half sail, the ship moved gracefully through the water and up the curve of the bank, and the flowering shrubs of the forest parted before its prow, and then they were sailing through the green dark of the jungle, while startled birds cawed and shrilled, and little animals paused in astonishment and peered down from the trees at the ship which sails over land and sea, and some almost lost their balance as the graceful boat progressed calmly over the floor of the forest, turning aside only for the thickest of the trees. And thus they made their way to the interior of the land called Oin, which lay to the north of the river Ar, which marked the border between Oin and the land called Yu, with which Oin shared a single capital. Oin was a country consisting largely of jungle and infertile plains, where the inhabitants farmed, for they feared the forest and would not go into it, even though it was where Oin's wealth might be found. The ship sailed well enough through the forest and out over the plain, and soon they could see a large lake glinting ahead of them, and Divim Tavar, glancing at the crude map with which he'd furnished himself in Ramazaz, suggested they begin to turn towards the south again and approach Doge Cam by means of a wide semicircle. Elric agreed, and the ship began to tack around. It was then that the land began to heave again, and huge waves of grassy earth this time rolled around the ship and blotted out the surrounding view. The ship pitched wildly up and down and from side to side. 2 more Imririans fell from the rigging and were killed on the deck below. The boatswain was shouting loudly, though in fact all this upheaval was happening in silence, and the silence made the situation seem that much more menacing. The boatswain yelled to his men to tie themselves to their positions.
"And all those not doing anything, get below at once!"
Elric had wound a scarf around the rail and tied the other end to his wrist. Divam Tavar had used a long belt for the same purpose, but still they were flung in all directions, often losing their footing as the ship bucked this way and that, and every bone in Elric's body seemed about to crack, and every inch of his flesh seemed bruised, and the ship was creaking and protesting and threatening to break up under the awful strain of riding the heaving land.
"Is this Grome's work, Elric? Or is it some sorcery of our coon's?"
Elric shook his head. "Not your coon. It is Grome, and I know no way to placate him, not Grome, who thinks least of all the kings of the elements, yet perhaps is most powerful."
"But surely he breaks his bargain with his brother by doing this to us?"
"No, I think not. King Strasha warned us this might happen. We can only hope that Grome expends all his energy, and that the ship survives, as it might survive a natural storm at sea."
"This is worse than a sea storm, Elric."
Elric nodded his agreement, but could say nothing, for the deck was tilting at a crazy angle, and he had to cling to the rails with both hands in order to retain any kind of footing. And now the silence stopped. Instead they heard a rumbling and a roaring that seemed to have something of the character of laughter.
King Grome, let us be. We have done you no harm."
But the laughter increased, and it made the whole ship quiver as the land rose and fell around it, as trees and hills and rocks rushed towards the ship, and then fell away again, never quite engulfing them, for Grome doubtless wanted his ship intact.
"Grome, you have no quarrel with mortals. Let us be. Ask a favor of us if you must, but grant us this favor in return."
Elric was shouting almost anything that came into his head. Really, he had no hope of being heard by the Earth God, and did not expect King Grome to bother to even listen, even if the elemental did hear. But there was nothing else to do.
Grome, listen to me."
Elric's only response was in the louder laughter which made every nerve in him tremble, and the earth heaved higher and dropped lower, and the ship spun round and round until Elric was sure he would lose his senses entirely.
King Grome, is it just to slay those who have never done you harm?"
And then, slowly, the heaving earth subsided, and the ship was still, and a huge, brown figure stood looking down at the ship. The figure was the color of earth and looked like a vast old oak. His hair and his beard were the color of leaves, and his eyes were the color of gold ore, and his teeth were the color of granite, and his feet were like roots, and his skin seemed covered in tiny green shoots in place of hair, and he smelled rich and musty and good. And he was King Grome of the earth elementals. He sniffed, and he frowned, and he said in a soft, mighty voice that was yet coarse and grumpy,
"I want my ship."
"It is not our ship to give, King Grome."
"I want my ship. I want the thing. It is mine."
"Of what use is it to you, King Grome?"
"Use. It is mine."
Grome stamped, and the land rippled. Elric said desperately, "It is your brother's ship, King Grome. It is King Strasha's ship. He gave you part of his domain, and you allowed him to keep the ship. That was the bargain."
"I know nothing of a bargain. The ship is mine."
"You know that if you take the ship, then King Strasha will have to take back the land he gave you."
"I want my ship."
The huge figure shifted its position and bits of earth fell from it, landing with distinctly heard thuds on the ground below and on the deck of the ship. "Then you must kill us to obtain it."
Kill? Grome does not kill mortals. He kills nothing. Grome builds. Grome brings to life.
"You have already killed 3 of our company. 3 are dead, King Grome, because you made the landstorm." Grome's great brows drew together and he scratched his great head, causing an immense rustling noise to sound.
"Grome does not kill,"
he said again. "King Grome has killed. 3 lives lost."
"But I want my ship."
"The ship is lent to us by your brother. We cannot give it to you. Besides, we sail in it for a purpose. A noble purpose, I think.
I know nothing of purposes, and care nothing for you. I want my ship. My brother should not have lent it to you. I had almost forgotten it, but now that I remember it, I want it."
"Will you not accept something else in the place of the ship, King Grome?" said Divim Tavar. "Some other gift?" Grome shook his monstrous head.
"How could a mortal give me something? It is mortals who take from me all the time. They steal my bones and my blood and my flesh. Could you give me back all that your kind has taken?"
"Is there not one thing?" Grome closed his eyes. "Precious metals, jewels. We have many such in Melniboné."
"I have plenty."
Elric shrugged in despair. How can we bargain with a god, Divim Tavar?" He gave a bitter smile. "What can the Lord of the Soul desire? More sun, more rain? These are not ours to give."
"I am a rough sort of god, if indeed god I am. But I did not mean to kill your comrades. I have an idea. Give me the bodies of the slain. Bury them in my earth."
Elric's heart leapt. "That is all you wish of us?"
"It would seem much to me."
"And for that you will let us sail on?"
"On water, aye. But I do not see why I should allow you to sail over my land. It is too much to expect of me. You can go to yonder lake, but from now this ship will only possess the properties bestowed upon it by my brother Strasha. No longer shall it cross my domain."
"But King Grome, we need this ship. We are upon urgent business. We need to sail to the city yonder." Elric pointed in the direction of Doe's Cam.
"You may go to the lake, but after that the ship will sail only on water. Now, give me what I ask."
Elric called down to the boatswain, who for the first time seemed amazed by what he was witnessing. "Bring up the bodies of the 3 dead men." The bodies were brought up from below. Grome stretched out one of his great earthy hands and picked them up.
"I thank you. Farewell."
And slowly Grome began to descend into the ground, his whole huge frame becoming, atom by atom, absorbed with the earth, until he was gone. And then the ship was moving again, slowly towards the lake, on the last short voyage it would ever make upon the land. And thus our plans are thwarted. Divim Tavar looked miserably towards the shining lake. "Aye, so much for that scheme. I hesitate to suggest this to you, Elric, but I fear we must resort to sorcery again if we are to stand any chance of achieving our goal." Elric sighed. "I fear we must."